Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? Our keynote speaker this afternoon is Dr. Ellen Fisher. Dr. Fisher serves as the Vice President for Research at UNM and is a professor of chemistry. She came to UNM from Colorado State University, where she served as Associate Vice President for Strategic Initiatives and Senior Faculty Advisor in the Office of the Vice President for Research. Prior to these appointments, Dr. Fisher served as chair of the Department of Chemistry at CSU and as the founding director of the Interdisciplinary Cross-College School of Advanced Materials Discovery. So thank you for being here, Dr. Fisher, and I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim. And I am sharing my screen. I hope, can everybody see that? Just nod. Okay, perfect. So I am going to spend a little time this afternoon talking about some team science research that we did at Colorado State. But I thought I would start, and I was going back to look at what title I had submitted for this keynote, and I couldn't find that I had given anybody a title anywhere. So I made one up based on a comment that Provost Holloway made in his opening remarks on Tuesday. He said that team research was a learned sport. And I think that that's one of the messages of what I'm going to talk about today. And then after Provost Holloway spoke, President Stokes came on and basically commented about how we had at UNM had set the stage for team research through the Grand Challenges program and through the people who are putting this on, the interdisciplinary science co-op. And it made me start to also think about, okay, you know, there's a lot more to setting structures is a good thing, but there are other things that are needed to really get us to a place where we're really doing team research well. So I thought I'd start with just saying, where do we go from here? And on Tuesday, Michael O'Rourke gave a great keynote where he talked a lot about common ground and thinking about common ground as things like shared information understanding, common language, and also thinking about teams in their context. And I thought that was a really, really good setting, and also using the toolbox dialogue as a really good mechanism or tool for actually promoting those kinds of conversations and getting teams sort of on that first page of how do we work together. Then yesterday we had two panels, one that was faculty and one that was administrators, talking about what the barriers and benefits to doing team research, what are those and what do they look like? And it was a really interesting conversation in both panels. It was a very interesting conversation, and I've put up here some of the take-homes from that. It's great to work together with other people. We get to learn, we get to think differently about what we do, but it's also hard. It's really hard to do team research. It is exhausting and time consuming and often under-rewarded in many respects. Under and unrewarded. And I think one of the other messages I took away from that is that everyone needs to be part of the team. And that's not just the people on the team, but it's also the researchers on the team, but it's also all of the support personnel that help the team do what they want to do, and the administration and the various functions and infrastructure at the university that can help with that. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think the science of team science, in other words, the study of what makes for effective and productive teams, can actually help us get to that place by being proactive and intentional about how we think about team research at the academy or in the academy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about putting theory into practice and thinking about how we have to shift our culture and our paradigms to really truly embrace team research. And to think about how we do that actively and with education and intervention. So I'm going to start with a little bit of what comes out of the literature with respect to the science of team science, and with the Google study that looked at how do we form the best teams. And I heard a remark over this week about how you want to get all your superstars to be on one team. And so Google actually set out to think about this as how do we form really great teams. And what they did was they did the same thing. They said, okay, what if we put all the people that are really strong performers, or what if we put all the people that are all extroverts or all introverts, and put people that are friends together, all those things that people say about what makes for a good team. And so they decided that what they would do is study 180 of their internal teams, and the ones that were successful, where success was described as being that the team had outperformed their goals. And so they looked at those teams and they looked for any kinds of patterns that might exist around gender balance or socializing outside of work, whether or not they were friends, whether or not they were all introverts, any of those things. And the bottom line is that it was impossible for them to find any patterns. There was no evidence at all for that the team composition was what was important in creating successful teams. The who didn't matter, and that really went against conventional wisdom. But the interesting thing to me is that what they did find were that there were some things that were very important. And what they found were these 5 factors that existed on all of their successful teams. And those were dependability, meaning that team members could count on their team members to do what they said they were going to do. That there was roles and structure, very clearly defined roles and responsibility, and some structure around the team and its activities. That there was psychological safety, that people felt like it was okay to throw out that wild, crazy idea and in order to be able to advance to achieve their goals. And that their work had meaning and impact. And I think that with scientific teams, we often don't, we think that what we do has meaning. And so from that standpoint, that's not something that we have to worry about too much on scientific teams. But the real key here is that a person's role on a team or their existence as a team member has to have meaning to them, and that they have to feel like the work that they're doing is going to have some larger impact. And that got talked about quite a bit yesterday in the 2 panels with the faculty and the administrators. And then the other critical thing was that there had to be what they deemed to be critical group norms. And so as an example of this, some teams, that if everybody got to all talk at once, that was, as long as everybody understood that that's the way that the team functioned, that was okay. If everybody took turns, that was okay too. So it had to do with the team knowing either explicitly or implicitly what the accepted group norms were for how they were going to interact with each other. So if we take that and say, well, okay, how do we then translate that to the world of academia, to academic research teams? There's a lot of differences, and I'm not going to go over these in great and gory detail, but I've just put up a few here that make some differences in terms of how we work with teams, either in an industry or business setting versus how we do in academia. And I think the primary ones I would focus on here are that in an industry or business setting, individuals are often only on a single team, and that everybody on that team, one way or another, is really focused on the bottom line because that's what the company is focused on. So there's a goal there, and everybody has a shared goal. And that reward structures are then focused on team success. And these are generalizations, and I'll admit that, but this is a way to think about then when we shift those kinds of studies to thinking about how do we create successful teams within an academic environment. Individuals within the academy are often on multiple teams. And so that makes a big difference in terms of how they're splitting their time, whether or not they've got enough energy or bandwidth to work on different teams and so forth. And the other thing is that faculty, by and large, get to define for themselves what they're going to focus on, what kind of research projects they're going to undertake. And so that also becomes a big difference in terms of there's not a single goal for the entire institution. And the last one I'm going to mention before moving on, because there are others, we could spend a lot of time on this, but the reward structure very much is focused on individual success. And that also really changes the nature of what it means to work in a team within an academic environment. So one of the first things then that I'm going to suggest is that we need to think about culture change for the institution to achieve team success. And so one of the things I've heard this whole week and at other times, being at UNM and other institutions, is that we say things like, we value team research. That's one of our values. We are really interested in promoting interdisciplinarity and being able to make an impact with our grand challenges and things like that. And so in order to really have that be true, we need our values to align with our policies and practices. And that isn't always the case. And so we need to be thinking about, have we adjusted our tenure and promotion policies or our department codes to really, truly go after that idea that we are valuing team research. And then then the policies have to translate into individual practices. So we may put that into a policy, but is that really the way that decisions are getting made at a department level or between individuals? And then the last piece there is then recognition and response. So we have to recognize how great the team research is that we're doing. And I'll just say that this provides some looping behavior where you could, that getting recognition and response for team research can feed back into practices and policies and so forth. Two other pieces to this I think that are really important to note is that we can do education and intervention if we really want to affect culture change. And the education, in my mind, helps to change policies and practices, or it can impact there. And interventions, what I'm calling interventions, are sort of an active management strategy where we're stepping in to help teams when they're floundering, or even if they just need a boost. And that's kind of what I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about, is how we did that with some teams at Colorado State. Okay. So to think about understanding team development and structures, I'm going to start with what's in the literature about that, and then I'm going to show you what that looks like for some actual teams. So team structures have a lot of different functions or different forms, and there's a spectrum, and I'm just going to have 3 of them here on this slide. And I want you to think about these diagrams in terms of information flow. And the one I have on the far left, the hierarchical team, is where you have somebody who's at the top, and all the information flows from that person down to the next layer, down to the next layer. And this is really actually a team structure that works well in some situations. If you think about first responders, if you think about the Navy SEALs, they often operate in a hierarchical fashion, and that works very effectively. The one in the center we're calling leader-centric team, and you can see there that you have one person that's sort of the center of everything, and all the information flows to that person. Again, there are places where that kind of a structure works really well. In the case of academic research teams, what we'd like to see is that what we call an integrated research team. That's really our gold standard. And the main thing to take away from here is that there are a lot of connections, and it appears that everybody's fully integrated. And I should point out that the 2 diagrams in the center and on the right are social network diagrams, where the circles represent individual team members, and those are nodes, and then the connectors, the arrows, represent the strength of the ties between the individuals on the team. So when you look at the integrated research team as being sort of the gold standard for how we act, I want you to keep that figure in mind as I show you a couple of social network diagrams for some of the teams that we've been working with. So if you take that, the other thing I want to say about team formation, so that was about team structure. So team formation, there's quite a bit in the literature dating way back that suggests that there are different stages of team formation, that teams go through, and they're cleverly called forming, storming, norming, and performing. So if you look at this graph, on the x-axis is time, the y-axis being productivity, what you see is that initially during the forming stages, homogeneous teams that are well managed will just usually skyrocket on the productivity initially, and then they tend to plateau over time. Whereas if you look at the ones that are diverse teams that are well managed, over time, they will tend to outperform the homogeneous teams, but they have some space of time where they have to actually go through a formation process. And this is really what Michael O'Rourke was talking about from the philosophical standpoint of, and that using the toolbox to try to get us to all talk the same language and to have common ground. That's what's happening in that forming stage. And there's not going to be a lot of productivity during that stage. But once they get past that, the diverse teams tend to outperform the homogeneous teams. I also am going to point out here that teams also reform, that teams change over time, and that's to be expected. So with that, I want to show you, this is a timeline for one of the teams that we were working with at Colorado State. And a couple of things I want to point out. This is just a timeline over 15 years, and I'm not going to spend a lot of go into all the detail, but I want to point out that the team really formed because a graduate student connected 2 faculty members. And what we found in our research is that grad students can really be connectors and can actually be the catalyst that ultimately where teams can get formed and also where they can find their highest productivity. So back in 2003, Graduate Student connected 2 faculty members. In 2004, they added a postdoc. And so that's really the inception of the team. It was with 4 team members. And then I also want to point out that over the next couple of years, they submitted multiple proposals that were rejected. So again, this is the forming stage where they're not being that productive. They're putting out research proposals, but they aren't being successful. In 2007, that's when their first NSF proposal was successful, and the membership increased from 4 to 9 members. The rest of it, I'm not going to go into detail, but I want to point out that in 2018, the team had grown to 43 team members. And just to show you what that looks like in terms of the composition of the team, this is that composition over those 15 years. And what you can see is that there are PIs, postdocs, graduate students, undergraduate students. There was a lab manager that they hired on towards the end of the last few years. And then there were also a number of external collaborators that included community members, both local and federal government agencies. This is a wildlife team. So they were working with wildlife agencies. And then I want to show you some network diagrams. And again, I don't have time to go into all this, but I really want you to think about the shape of these diagrams and how the social network analysis is helping us to think about how the teams are interacting. And so this particular set of network diagrams are social network measures of productivity, where we ask people, who have you done research with, or consulting, grants, publications, or have you served on a student committee? And again, the thing to take away from this is not only that the diagrams look very much like that ideal gold standard that I showed you a few minutes ago, but also that over time that some of the more junior members of the team were migrating to become core members of the productivity network. This next set of diagrams, the top one is a mentoring network, where we ask people, who is your mentor on the team? And the lower one is, who do you go to for advice? So again, I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time looking at the details of this, but a couple of things to note. Again, we see very closely integrated networks where people are talking to each other, are asking other people for advice. And here the arrows denote who people are going to for advice. And we notice that the arrows are pretty agnostic with respect to the role, that even, with the possible exception of the undergraduates, everybody's going to other people for advice. It doesn't really matter. It's not just to the PIs on the team. So this is really what we'd like to see. We consider this to be one of our exemplary teams that were very high functioning. But just to show you that there's ways to even help a high functioning team improve in its productivity. One other piece of literature that I'm going to throw out there is a paper that was published in 2011 by Woolley and coworkers. And this is where she talks a lot about the collective intelligence, or the C factor. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but one of the factors that was seen to affect team performance was even turn taking. And this is exactly what it says, and why I have a picture of children here is it's what you learned in kindergarten, that you need to share, and that people need to have time to speak in meetings and things like that. So we did an intervention with this team. And these are just essentially the way we collected these data was we had a researcher embedded in the team that would observe the team during team meetings and take note of the amount of time that each person spoke. So if you just focus on the left-hand side, 2015, each of those bars represents a team member. And what you're looking at is basically the delta for each team member away from the average amount of time that each team member spoke during the meeting. And what you see is that we have people that are below average, as you might imagine, and we have some that are above. What you don't see is that the ones that are below average are primarily students, and the ones that are above average are primarily faculty. And so what we did is, and I'm calling this an intervention, is that we actually went and talked to the PIs, said, explained to them what we were observing, and gave them some tools and tricks for how they could have team meetings where graduate students were encouraged and were given the space and time to actually speak. And so what you see in the 2016 diagram is that we still have people that are above average and that are below average, and they still are primarily students that are below and primarily faculty that are above. But the deltas are much smaller for each of the team members. So they really were having much more even turn taking in their meetings. So the last piece here that I'm going to show you a couple things, and then I'm going to stop, is that just to show you that that we don't always get it right. That this was a team that we had given, that we had been in our program, and this was their network diagram for their history of working together. So if you look at this, it really does echo all those other diagrams that I've just shown you. And it looks like this is a great team with a lot of promise for being a very productive team. But as we went over time, what we saw in terms of this is the same question: do you have a history of working together? In 2016 and 2017, that you see that the network has kind of fallen apart, and you also end up with a lot of what we call isolates, which are the single circles down at the bottom of these diagrams, indicating that these individuals did not report that they spoke to any, or that they had had a history of working together, even though in the original one they had said that they did. So this was a team that had huge apparent potential that was largely unrealized. And so we called this one of our pseudo teams. So with that, we did a process intervention where we created a whole pre-teaming program that would help with team formation and development prior to a large investment. So we created a program where we gave a small amount of funding to a larger number of teams, gave them professional development. It was a program that lasted for about 9 months. The goal then was to get those teams to apply for funding to our larger program, which was a Grand Challenges-like program, and ultimately then to get establishing a disciplinary research network for those teams, and that they would become international leaders. And what we found was that this was largely successful and I'll again show you just one more piece of data, that in this second cohort of this larger program, we had 5 teams, and 4 of them were selected based on the fact that they had very innovative and creative ideation. They had really super duper ideas. And they also had been part of this pre-teaming activity, and they had lots of strengths as a team. And we had one team, however, team 1, that was selected based on they had really, really creative ideas. They had not really worked together. They hadn't been part of our pre-teaming process, but this was a strategic decision that was made by the decision maker in this particular instance. And just to show you that that didn't work out very well, here's the team 1. This is the Who Do You Go To for Advice network before they actually formally started the program. And then about 6 months after they started, you can see that their advice network, there are more connections that are being made, and it's a little bit closer network, and there are fewer isolates. But if you look at the difference then with team 3 that went through the pre-teaming process, you can see that it starts out as a fairly, you have a nice core network there that's starting for this team. And then 6 months into the program, they pulled in additional team members, and they really had created a very nice advice network. One more piece of data for team 1, just to show you that this was not a terribly successful team. We also asked people how they felt about being on their team, whether or not their team meetings were fun, whether or not they felt like their team was going to get something done, and whether or not their contributions were valued. And the main thing to take away from this slide is just that team 1 really does look like the odd person out, or the odd team out, in that all the other teams had very strong responses. Everybody pretty much agreed, strongly agreed with the statements that were presented. But team 1, people were not feeling terribly confident about the team. Ultimately, we stopped funding that team, and they disbanded. So from that standpoint, it was not a success. So this is my last slide. I think that just to leave you with a couple of thoughts here, that I think to have really effective teams at UNM, we need to create a shared vision, shift our culture to align with our values more closely, and develop a set of guiding principles for how we actively manage our research teams, how we provide support for them, how we develop accountability measures to ensure that our teams are continuing to progress, and then providing education and effective interventions for team success. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions or thoughts or reflections or anything from anyone.
Are there any questions? We have about 5 minutes.
Well, if they don't jump in, Ellen, I will. This is Mary Jo.
Of course it is.
So what does it mean for us? Oh, Mindy's got her hand up. Go to Mindy.
Well, I'm just so pumped up by that. I'm so excited by that presentation and just the opportunities that you bring to us with that background. And I just, my question is really just inviting you to take that a little bit further with your own ideas for how specifically we might do that at UNM and what your current thoughts are for making that happen.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. One that I can point to. One is that we've been having some conversations around the grand challenges in particular, because that's one of the larger pieces that is already sort of in place, as President Stokes said, and we don't want to lose that. But I think that we need to be a little bit more proactive about how we're managing those teams and how we can help them to continue to be more successful. Tim and Mary Jo and I had a conversation a few weeks ago, and I've since had some conversations with the main campus Grand Challenges teams. And I think that there are some specific things that each team needs. And I'm not going to say we're going to do the same thing for all of the teams, because given where they are now, I do think that they need some interventions, to use my term here. But they're going to be different in different places. And for example, one of the things that I think is really important is project management. And that's something that, for example, I'm not going to pick on anybody, but the water team, that's something I think they could really benefit from. So we're going to think about ways that we can provide them with some support with respect to project management. And I think other teams might need something different. The second thing that I would point to is that I'd like to think about how we might be able to start doing some of the work that we did in the pre-teaming thing, which I think we started really nicely with this conference. That I would say that what was being done with respect to the faculty teams, and I was able to listen to some of those presentations earlier today, I think that's a really good start, and being able to provide some funding, small funding for convening and visioning, and that part of that though has to be that we give support to understanding what it means to function as a team. We found that when we provided some of the literature on team science, that made a huge difference, especially to people in the STEM disciplines who might want to poo-poo social sciences and how impactful it might be on them. When we taught them things like even turn taking and social sensitivity and things like that, that really altered how they viewed functioning as a team, but also giving them some real practical skills like, things like marketing and visioning and skills with how to do that, and connections to things like the foundation, and finding if there may be those kind of atypical kinds of funders for their research. So I think there's things we can do about that as well. And again, I think this conference has been a really good start to thinking about how we provide structure and support for the teams, and being able to shift the culture around that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fisher. Unfortunately, we're just about out of time. We have another session that begins in less than 2 minutes. So see you all at the award ceremony and wrap up. Thank you. And thank you again, Dr. Fisher. Thank you.